The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was never the aircraft pilots dreamed about. In the ready rooms and officers' clubs across the Pacific, young men spoke in hushed admiration of the Supermarine Spitfire graceful, a machine that seemed to anticipate a pilot's intentions before his hands moved across the controls. They spoke too of the North American Mustang, sleek and purpose-built, an aircraft that carried within it the promise of speed and superiority. But the P-47, the Jug as it came to be called by those who flew it, was something altogether different. It was heavy. It was brutal. It was a flying hammer, and it would take a particular kind of pilot, one shaped by experience rather than romance, to understand what that truly meant. Major George "Chuck" Owens was 32 years old when he arrived at Noemfour Airfield in the summer of 1944. And he carried with him the weathered appearance of a man who had already lived several lifetimes in uniform. His face bore the deep tan of someone who had spent years in tropical climates, his eyes carrying a clarity from countless hours scanning empty sky for shapes that might kill him. He had joined the Army Air Forces in 1941, before America entered the war, and had watched the Pacific conflict unfold from the perspective of those who fought it closest. Not from strategy maps in distant headquarters, from the seats of aircraft, from the windswept aprons of island airfields, from the moments immediately before and after violence. By the time he arrived at Noemfour, Owens had completed 42 combat sorties. He was, by any measure, a veteran. He was also, by any measure that mattered to history, entirely unknown. Owens had been assigned to the 312th Fighter Squadron, a unit operating primarily in the ground attack role. Their Thunderbolts for close support missions over the Japanese-held territories of New Guinea and the Philippines. The P-47, in its natural habitat, was not a high-altitude interceptor chasing enemy bombers across distant skies. It was a predator of low-level targets, a machine designed to rake airfields with machine gun fire, to strafe truck convoys, to suppress anti-aircraft positions while infantrymen advanced below. The 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns arrayed in the Thunderbolt's wings were optimized for this task. They could shred trucks, tear through fortifications, and turn soft targets into wreckage. The aircraft's thick skin of aluminum armor plating, the redundant systems, the capacity to absorb punishment that would send more fragile fighters spiraling toward the earth, these were not accidental features. They were purpose-built characteristics of an aircraft to operate in an environment where the enemy shot back with everything they had and never relented. The bond between Owens and his particular Thunderbolt, the one his ground crew had christened Meat Chopper, in reference to its strafing capability, had formed gradually, almost imperceptibly, through the accumulated weight of missions flown and risks survived. A pilot did not fall in love with the P-47 in the way young men fell in love with the Spire. Instead, something deeper and more practical developed. Trust. Trust born from the knowledge that when flak erupted from below and the aircraft shuddered with impacts, when hydraulic systems held and engines continued turning, when the Thunderbolt's inherent stability allowed precision firing runs at targets mere feet below, this machine would carry him home. Owens had flown enough missions to understand that the Jug's weight, which seemed a liability in conventional dogfights, became an advantage in the grinding reality of Pacific air operations. An aircraft could absorb punishment and still fly. An aircraft whose dive characteristics were predictable and reliable. An aircraft that did not demand constant input and correction, but which allowed a pilot to focus on the task at hand, finding targets, delivering fire, surviving another day. The practical realities operating from Noemfour were themselves a form of education. The airfield was constructed from pierced steel matting laid across swamp and sand, a surface that shimmered with heat distortion during the day and transformed into treacherous mud whenever the tropical rains came. And in New Guinea, the rains came with regularity that bordered on the absolute. The maintenance crews who kept the Thunderbolts flying operated in conditions that would have seemed impossible to American mechanics trained in stateside depots. They worked in humidity so thick it seemed almost liquid, in temperatures that exhausted even young and fit, in an environment where rust and corrosion were not occasional problems, but constant, grinding adversaries. Every hour the aircraft sat exposed to the salt air and tropical moisture was an hour of accelerated decay. Every sortie meant salt water in the landing gear, sand in the engine cowlings, mud caked into wheel wells. The men who maintained these aircraft exhausted, far from home, operating with resources that never quite matched the demands placed upon them represented a heroism that rarely received recognition in histories written by those far from the actual fighting. Owens understood this, perhaps because he had been flying long enough to recognize how dependent his life had become on the unseen labor of others. The pilots received the recognition when they returned safely from missions, the accolades when they achieved results. But every return depended on engineers and mechanics who had worked through the night to repair battle damage, to replace worn components, to coax engines back to life after exposure to conditions that seemed designed to destroy everything they touched. Owens had learned the names of his crew chiefs, had learned to listen to them when they counseled against pushing a particular aircraft too hard, had learned to recognize when Meat Chopper was flying true, and when something subtle had shifted in her handling that suggested something deeper was wrong. By September 1944, Owens had completed enough missions to understand the rhythms and patterns of Pacific Air operations. The Japanese opposition had evolved from the days of abundance to days of scarcity, fewer aircraft, fewer trained pilots, an increasingly desperate allocation of remaining resources to the defense of territory that everyone recognized was slipping away. Yet desperation could make opponents more dangerous, not less. A pilot who knew he was likely flying his last mission sometimes fought with an intensity born from fatality. The Japanese remained lethal, and the sky remained unforgiving. Owens had survived this long not through luck, though luck had certainly played its role, but through a combination of skill honed through repetition and a clear-eyed understanding of the machinery he flew and the enemy he faced. He was, in the most literal sense, ready for whatever the war might still demand of him. The morning of September 1944 began like so many others at NOM-4. The sun rose over the airfield before the men were fully awake, turning the humid air into something almost solid, pressing down on the earth and everyone who moved across it. By 0600 hours, the maintenance crews were already working, running through pre-flight checks on a dozen Thunderbolts lined up along the pierced steel matting. Owens arrived at his aircraft, Meat Chopper, shortly after 0700, moving through the ritualistic steps he had performed dozens of times before. The ground crew chief, a sergeant named Paulson from somewhere in Ohio, walked him through the particulars. Fuel tanks topped, all 850 caliber gunned and armed, hydraulic systems holding pressure, engine cowling temperatures nominal. There were no surprises. There never were on mornings when the missions were routine. The briefing had been straightforward: escort a photographic reconnaissance run over the Philippines, provide top cover for the camera ship as it conducted its survey work, and return to base by 100 hours. Safe. The kind of mission that pilots completed without incident hundreds of times across the Pacific theater. By 0800 hours, Owens and his two wingmen, Cap Michael Torres and First Lieutenant James Hartwell, were airborne, climbing away from NOM-4 toward their assigned patrol altitude of 24,000 feet. The Thunderbolt was never fast in the climb, and the three aircraft rose through the tropical humidity like swimmers pushing through increasingly dense water. Behind them, the reconnaissance variant P-47, stripped of weapons and equipped with cameras instead, maintained formation as they ascended. The Pacific stretched below in shades of blue, so intense they seemed almost unreal, studded with islands that appeared as small, fragile things from this altitude. Radio chatter crackled in Owens's headset, occasional transmissions from the photo ship, periodic updates from ground control, the standard procedural communications that formed the rhythm of combat operations. Nothing to suggest that anything in the day's carefully planned routine would deviate from the script. The patrol proceeded without incident through the morning hours. Owens and his wingmen maintained their positions, their eyes scanning the horizon and the sky above and below in the practiced manner of men trained to spot danger at distance. The sun climbed higher, and the heat inside the cockpit intensified. The oxygen mask became something sticky and uncomfortable against his face. Somewhere around 9:45 hours, ground control transmitted a contact report. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted at high altitude, position vector provided, requesting intercept. The instructions came through with the flat, clinical tone of officers working from maps and radar returns, the kind of detachment that came from being far enough from the actual flying that the risk existed only as an abstract concept. Owens acknowledged the transmission, banked his formation toward the new heading, and began climbing toward the reported position. The climb took them higher still, pushing toward the upper limits of the Thunderbolt's operational envelope. At 26,000 feet, the air had become so thin that the aircraft's responsiveness had degraded noticeably. The controls felt heavier, requiring more deliberate inputs. The engine's performance had fallen off as the air density diminished. Owens was conscious of these degradations in the way a pilot becomes conscious of his aircraft's capabilities and limitations after dozens of missions, not as intellectual knowledge, but as embodied understanding, a kind of kinesthetic sense of what the machine beneath him could and could not do. Around 27,000 feet, Torres's voice crackled through the radio, distorted by static and the poor propagation characteristics of ultra-high-frequency transmissions. There were aircraft ahead, difficult to distinguish against the cloud tops. Owens pressed higher, toward 28,000 feet, approaching the practical ceiling of the P-47. Then, without clear transition, the situation fractured. Radio interference, sudden and complete, severed communication between the three Thunderbolts. Owens reached for his radio controls, adjusting frequencies, attempting to re-establish contact, but found only static. The formation, which had maintained relative cohesion through the climb, began to separate. Torres and Hartwell, unable to hear Owens's transmissions and unable to see him through the broken cloud layer that now surrounded them, turned toward what they believed was the intercept vector. Owens, unable to communicate and unable to locate his wingman visually, made the decision to continue climbing through the cloud deck, pushing toward the altitude where the reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted. When he emerged above the cloud layer into brilliant, harsh sunlight, the world had changed. 5 aircraft were arrayed at various altitudes in the thin air, and they were not American. Even at distance, even in the peculiar perspective of high-altitude geometry, Owens recognized the silhouettes. Japanese. His mind processed the details with the speed that comes from training and repetition. The aircraft appeared to be a mix of types Oscars and possibly Zeros, single-engine fighters that had no business being at this altitude by any measure of conventional doctrine. Yet here they were, clearly positioned in what could only be described as an ambush configuration. The photoship was nowhere to be seen. His wingmen were nowhere to be seen. He was alone at 28,000 feet, pilot in a Thunderbolt, facing 5 trained, armed Japanese pilots who had clearly anticipated American presence and had positioned themselves to exploit advantage. The cold mathematics of the situation crystallized with absolute clarity. His fuel state, checked moments before, showed adequate reserves for the planned mission profile, but nothing approaching the luxury of extended maneuvering at this altitude. His ammunition load was standard 2,700 rounds distributed across 8 guns, more than enough for most engagements, but not unlimited. His aircraft was heavy, designed for different altitudes and different tactics. The Japanese fighters, lighter and more maneuverable, occupied superior positions. Every equation suggested retreat, descent to lower altitude where the Thunderbolt's characteristics were more favorable, return to base to report the contact and allow other forces to deal with the threat. Tactical wisdom, the kind taught in schools and preached in briefings, recommended discretion. But Owens had completed 42 sorties. He understood that the war did not care for wisdom or retreat. He understood that 5 Japanese pilots, positioned above him with advantage, would not simply allow him to descend unmolested. They would press, would attack, would force engagement, or cause him to bleed altitude and maneuverability in defensive maneuvering. Better to control the terms of engagement than to have it forced upon him. Better to use what advantages his aircraft possessed, its weight, its energy characteristics in a dive, its 8 guns, than to deny them through evasion. The decision formed without conscious deliberation, the product of training and experience and the simple recognition that this moment had arrived and would not be denied by wishing it away. Owens adjusted his throttle, selected his gun armament switches to full, and began to turn toward the enemy fighters arrayed in the sky above and around him. The first Japanese pilot made his move with the confidence of a man who had flown many combat sorties and had survived them through superior maneuvering. As Owens turned toward the enemy formation, the nearest Oscar rolled into a steep bank and began a diving turn that was meant to position the Japanese fighter for an attack run across the Thunderbolt's tail. It was a textbook maneuver, executed with precision, the kind of turn that had worked countless times before against adversaries less experienced or flying less capable aircraft. The Oscar was faster in the turn, tighter in the radius, the advantages of its lighter weight and responsive control surfaces made manifest in the geometry of its flight path. Any pilot flying a conventional fighter, a Spitfire, a Mustang at moderate altitude would have found himself quickly outmaneuvered, forced to extend away and lose advantage. But Owens was not flying a conventional fighter. He was flying a Thunderbolt, and he had spent enough time learning its characteristics to understand how to explode. Instead of attempting to match the Oscar's turn, Owens pulled his nose up into a climbing turn, deliberately steepening his angle of attack. The move was counterintuitive by the standards of aerial combat doctrine that emphasized maintaining speed and maneuverability. But the P-47's characteristics were different. The aircraft was heavy enough that its momentum carried it upward, even as the thinner air at 28,000 feet reduced the effectiveness of aerodynamic lift. The Japanese pilot, expecting Owens to either extend away or attempt a tighter turn, found himself suddenly behind and below a Thunderbolt that was climbing away rather than fleeing. The Oscar pilot, committed to his initial tactical approach, began to pull harder on the stick, attempting to follow Owens's climbing maneuver. But climbing in thin air, at the edge of the aircraft's operational envelope, required energy that the Oscar possessed in abundance, could not sustain. The Japanese fighter's rate of climb fell off. Its turn radius widened. Within seconds, what had been a pursuing advantage had transformed into a disadvantage. Owens recognized the moment with the clarity of experience. As the Oscar's climb rate degraded and the Japanese pilot began to lose energy, began to reduce his own climb rate, converting his remaining altitude advantage into horizontal positioning. He rolled the Thunderbolt slightly, bringing his nose to bear on the Oscar's fuselage as the Japanese fighter struggled to recover from an energy bleed that had happened almost too quickly to correct. The .850 caliber Browning machine guns in the 47's wings held 2,700 rounds total, a prodigious amount of ammunition by the standards of fighter aircraft. Owens had learned through dozens of missions that discipline in expenditure mattered more than volume of fire. He waited until the ARS filled his gun sight, waited until the deflection angle was minimal, and then pressed the firing button. The Thunderbolt's nose blazed with muzzle flash as all 8 guns fired in synchronization, the recoil of the weapons creating a subtle shudder that a pilot could feel through the airframe. The rounds found their mark. The Oscar's fuselage, thin-skinned and lightly armored, was never designed to withstand the sustained impact of .850 caliber rounds. The aircraft's right wing root erupted into flame, and the Japanese pilot immediately rolled inverted and dove for the cloud deck below. Owens did not pursue. Instead, he maintained his altitude, scanning the sky for the remaining 4 Japanese fighters. The first engagement lasted less than a minute, compressed sequence of physics and geometry that had transformed a pursuit into a retreat. There was no triumph in the moment, no exultation. There was only the recognition that one problem had been partially solved and 4 remained. The second Japanese fighter came from a different angle, approaching from Owens's right and slightly below. A pilot who had learned from Watt's first engagement that conventional tactics might not work against this particular American. This pilot was attempting a more measured approach, maintaining distance, trying to set up for a pass from an angle where Owens's guns could not easily bear. The Japanese fighter was slightly ahead of Owens's wing, separated by perhaps 200 yards, moving through the thin air with a grace that the heavier Thunderbolt could not match in pure horizontal maneuvering. For a moment, the geometry of their relative positions suggested that the Japanese pilot had found an approach that might work. Owens understood that altitude was a form of currency at this extreme altitude, and he still possessed reserves of it. He pulled the nose of the Thunderbolt up slightly, steepening his climb, and began a climbing turn toward the Japanese fighter. The pattern repeated itself, though with slightly different geometry. The Oscar, attempting to follow Owens's climbing turn, found its performance degrading as the thin air sapped its energy. The climb rates fell off. The turn radius widened. The Japanese pilot, recognizing that he was losing the energy game, attempted to reverse his turn and dive away toward lower altitude where his aircraft would be more effective. But Owens had anticipated the move. As the Oscar began its escape dive, Owens rolled the Thunderbolt into a shallow dive himself, converting his remaining altitude advantage into speed. The mathematics of physics favored the heavier aircraft in this scenario. The Thunderbolt accelerated rapidly in the dive, its weight providing momentum that overcame the thin air's resistance to acceleration. Within seconds, Owens had closed the distance. The Oscar's fuselage appeared in his gun sight, still angled away but within effective firing range. Owens fired again, shorter bursts this time, conserving ammunition while maintaining enough firepower to damage the target. The rounds raked across the Oscar's fuselage and wing, and the Japanese, seeing his aircraft beginning to fail, continued his dive toward the cloud cover below. Owens did not follow him deeper into the cloud. Instead, he began a climbing turn back toward altitude, aware that the engagement had consumed time and fuel, and that he still faced 3 remaining fighters. His ammunition count, checked visually on the ammunition counters mounted on the instrument panel, showed that he had expended approximately 400 rounds. He still possessed ample reserves, but not infinite ones. The next engagements would need to be equally disciplined, equally economical in their application of force. The thin air around him seemed to crystallize his awareness of the situation. He was alone, at an altitude where his aircraft was operating at the very edge of its performance envelope, against an enemy that still held numerical advantage. The temperature inside the cockpit had dropped to near freezing despite the heated suit and the oxygen mask providing warm, pressurized air. His hands, even in flight gloves, were beginning to feel the cold. The physical sensation of the aircraft beneath him had become almost meditative, the subtle vibrations of the engine, the feel of the controls responding to his inputs, the constant gentle pressure of the harness holding him in the seat. The first 2 engagements had occupied perhaps 5 minutes of actual flying time, but they had felt like much longer. The remaining Japanese fighters were now more cautious, having witnessed what happened when conventional tactics applied to an aircraft with unconventional characteristics. The next engagements, Owens understood with absolute clarity, would be harder. The 3 remaining Japanese pilots had observed what their comrades had not survived to report. They had watched the Oscar dive away trailing smoke, had seen the pattern of Owens's tactics, the deliberate climb, the conversion of altitude into energy, the disciplined application of firepower. They understood now that conventional single-pilot attacks would not succeed against this American. What emerged instead was a coordinated approach born from desperation and the recognition that numerical advantage was their only remaining asset. The 3 Oscars began to spread out, moving to different quadrants of the sky, clearly attempting to establish a tactical arrangement where Owens could not face all 3 simultaneously, where at least one of them would maintain a firing position regardless of his maneuvers. Owens recognized the shift in enemy tactics with the clarity of a man who had flown enough sorties to understand how experienced pilots thought and adapted. The 3 Japanese fighters were now attempting to execute what amounted to a coordinated ambush, with each pilot responsible for a different approach vector. If Owens turned to face one attacker, the others would move to exploit his vulnerability. If he dove, one of them might have positioned themselves below to attack as he descended. If he climbed, the others would attempt to maintain altitude advantage and press from above. It was a sound tactical concept, and it represented a fundamental shift in the character of the engagement. What had been a series of one-on-one encounters was transforming into a 3-dimensional, multi-vector fight where the geometry of relative positions mattered more than individual pilot skill. The first coordinated attack came from above and slightly behind Owens's right wing. 2 of the Oscars dove simultaneously, their pilots pressing on the throttles to accelerate, attempting to achieve firing positions before Owens could maneuver away. Owens rolled hard to the right, pulling the nose of the Thunderbolt up in a maneuver that was part dive, part vertical turn, creating a vector that took him out of the immediate firing line while maintaining enough forward momentum to prevent stalling. The Japanese pilots, committed to their diving approach, found their targets suddenly displaced. They passed through the space where Owens had been moments before, their guns firing in an empty sky. The third Oscar, positioned to exploit this sequence, began a climbing turn from below, attempting to position itself for an attack as Owens recovered from his evasive maneuver. But Owens had anticipated the pattern. As the two diving Oscars began to recover from their pass, bleeding speed as they pulled out of the dive at thin altitude, Owens completed his own turn and began to climb toward the recovering enemy fighters. The third Oscar, attempting to execute its own climbing attack, found itself suddenly in a position where Owens's nose was pointed directly at it. Owens fired, short disciplined bursts that raked across the Oscar's fuselage. The Japanese pilot immediately broke away, diving to escape, but not before Owens's rounds had found their mark. Smoke began to trail from the Oscar's engine, visible even against the bright sky of the upper atmosphere. The Japanese pilot, recognizing that his aircraft was damaged beyond immediate repair, banked toward the cloud below and began a descent toward lower altitude and friendly territory. 3 fighters became 2. The mathematics of the engagement had shifted again, but Owens was acutely aware that his resources were not infinite. His ammunition count, checked on the firing counters, showed that he had expended approximately 900 rounds across the 3 engagements. That left him with roughly 1,800 rounds remaining, still substantial, but no longer the luxury of abundance. The fuel gauge told a similar story of depletion. The extended maneuvering at high altitude, the repeated climbs and dives, the sustained throttle settings required to maintain energy in thin air, all of it had consumed fuel at a rate higher than the standard cruise profile. His fuel state was still adequate, but the margins were beginning to narrow. He was no longer fighting from a position of unlimited resources. He was fighting within constraints that would grow tighter with every passing minute. The 2 remaining Japanese pilots appeared to understand this as well. Or perhaps they simply recognized that they had exhausted the advantage of numerical superiority, faced a choice between continued engagement and withdrawal. They separated, each taking a different approach vector, each had set up an attack from a different angle simultaneously. One Oscar climbed steeply, attempting to gain altitude advantage, while the other dove to a shallower angle, attempting to approach from below and behind. It was a logical tactical approach attack from 2 vectors simultaneously and force Owens to choose which threat to address first. The pilot he ignored would have an opportunity for an effective firing pass. Owens chose altitude. He pulled the nose of the Thunderbolt up into a steep climb, prioritizing the threat from above, accepting the vulnerability to the lower Oscar in exchange for addressing what he perceived as the more immediate danger. The climbing Oscar pursued, but the thin air and the Thunderbolt's weight allowed Owens to maintain his climb rate even as the Japanese fighter struggled to match it. Within moments, Owens had reversed the geometric advantage, positioning himself above and slightly behind the climbing Oscar. The Japanese pilot, recognizing the deteriorating situation, rolled inverted and dove away. Owens fired a short burst as the Oscar descended, seeing his rounds trace through the space the Japanese fighter had occupied, but uncertain whether he had achieved hits in the complexity of the maneuver. He had no time to assess. The second Oscar, the one attacking from below, had pressed its advantage during Owens's engagement with the climbing fighter. It had closed to within firing range and was raking the Thunderbolt's tail section with machine gun fire. Owens felt the impacts, the distinctive shudder and vibration of rounds finding their mark on his fuselage. His instruments remained functional, his hydraulics still responding to his inputs, but the aircraft had taken damage. Fresh bullet holes stitched across the tail section, one of them dangerously close to the vertical stabilizer. Owens immediately rolled into a turn, bringing his nose toward the attacking Oscar, and fired a sustained burst. The Oscar pilot, having committed to his attack run and finding the American turning directly into him, broke away sharply, rolling away from the firing pass to avoid the return fire. The engagement had shifted now into a series of shorter, more desperate passes, each pilot attempting to gain advantage for brief moments of firing opportunity before being forced to maneuver defensively. Owens's ammunition counter showed 600 rounds remaining. His fuel gauge indicated approximately 45 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to return to base, but not enough for extended additional maneuvering. The two Japanese pilots, still aloft, damaged but still flying, were pressing their attacks with a desperation that suggested they recognized they were also approaching resource constraints. The sky above 28,000 feet had become a narrow arena where physics and fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure had become as important as pilot skill. The engagement was no longer about tactical superiority. It was about attrition, about who would exhaust their resources first, about whether the remaining Japanese fighters would disengage and survive or press their attacks to the point of complete fuel starvation or ammunition depletion. The engagement had now compressed into its most desperate phase. Owens and the two remaining Japanese pilots were no longer conducting a coordinated dance of tactical maneuvering. Instead, the fight had devolved into a series of brief, violent passes where survival depended on reaction time and the rapidly diminishing margins of fuel and ammunition. The thin air at 28,000 feet seemed to crystallize around them, every maneuver requiring conscious effort, every climb more labored than the one before. Owens could feel the fatigue beginning to accumulate in his shoulders and arms, the sustained G-forces of repeated turns creating a weight that seemed to press down on his entire body. His breathing, regulated by the oxygen mask, felt mechanical and effortful. The cold that had been merely uncomfortable at the beginning of the engagement had become genuinely painful, a creeping numbness in his extremities that he recognized as dangerous, but which he set aside as irrelevant to the immediate problem of staying alive. The two Japanese pilots appeared to understand that they were reaching the limits of endurance as well. Their attacks, which had been executed with tactical precision in the earlier phases of the engagement, had become more direct and less coordinated. One of the Oscars attempted a head-on pass, a tactic that suggested the pilot was accepting mutual risk in exchange for the certainty of a firing opportunity. Owens rolled hard to his right, breaking the geometry of the head-on approach, and both aircraft fired as they passed. Owens felt rounds impact his fuselage again, new holes joining the existing damage from the earlier pass. He had no way to assess the damage while flying, and he pushed the concern aside. If something critical had been hit, he would know soon enough. If it hadn't, worrying about it accomplished nothing. As the two aircraft passed, Owens began a climbing turn, attempting to regain altitude advantage, but the maneuver was sluggish. The Thunderbolt's response time had changed subtly, becoming less immediate, more ponderous. Something in the aircraft's handling had shifted, and Owens realized with the cold clarity of experience that one of the Japanese rounds must have damaged a hydraulic or compromised some element of the flight control systems. The aircraft was still flying, still responsive to his inputs, but with a degraded quality that suggested a slow bleed of capability. He filed the observation away and continued the engagement. There was no choice but to continue. Descending now would mean turning his back to the remaining Japanese fighters, presenting them with undefended firing opportunities at his fuselage and engines. Better to maintain the fight and attempt to force a conclusion before his aircraft became too damaged to fly at all. The second Oscar came from below and to the left, a pilot who appeared to have learned from watching the first head-on pass not to attempt such a tactic again. Instead, this pilot was attempting a classic scissors maneuver, a defensive pattern designed to bring a pursuer around into a defensive position. But Owens understood the maneuver, had seen it executed dozens of times, and knew how to counter it. As the Oscar attempted to cross his nose, Owens pulled harder on the stick, tightening his turn radius, and fired a sustained burst directly into the Japanese fighter's fuselage. The Oscar, caught in the maneuver with sufficient energy to evade, took full weight of Owens's firepower across its wing root and engine cowling. The Japanese pilot immediately dove away, and this time the smoke trailing from the engine was not light wisps, but thick, dark plumes that suggested the engine had taken catastrophic damage. Owens watched the Oscar descend toward the cloud layer below, watched the smoke intensify, and recognized that the aircraft would not recover. The Japanese pilot, faced with an engine that was failing and altitude dropping rapidly, had only one option. He could attempt to glide to friendly territory. He could attempt to nurse the damaged engine down to an altitude where bailing out became possible. Either way, he was no longer a participant in the engagement. 4 Japanese fighters had been forced from the fight. 1 remained. The final Oscar climbed steeply, attempting to regain altitude advantage, but the maneuver was clearly desperate. Owens could see the Japanese pilot's calculations laid out in the geometry of the aircraft's flight path. The pilot had recognized that he was now alone, that his comrades had either been forced to disengage or were descending in damaged aircraft. The only question remaining was whether to press a final attack or to withdraw and preserve the aircraft. The climbing turn was hesitant, almost questioning. Owens interpreted it as uncertainty, as a pilot wrestling with the decision of whether to continue or retreat. Owens made the decision for him. He pulled the nose of his Thunderbolt up into a climbing turn that brought him into position above and behind the Oscar. The Japanese pilot, seeing the American's nose pointed directly at him, immediately rolled inverted and dove away. Owens fired as the Oscar descended, saw his rounds trace through the space the Japanese aircraft occupied, and recognized that the passes were now too distant, too fragmented, to guarantee hits. But the Japanese pilot was already committing to the dive, already sacrificing altitude in exchange for the certainty of escaping. Owens did not pursue deeply into the descent. His altitude advantage was nearly exhausted, his fuel state critical, his ammunition reduced to perhaps 300 rounds. The Japanese pilot, diving toward the cloud deck, had clearly decided that survival was preferable to continued engagement. The Oscar descended through the clouds and disappeared from view. Owens scanned the sky around him, searching for any sign of another threat, any indication that additional Japanese fighters had been vectored to the engagement. But the sky remained empty. The other American pilots, Torres and Hartwell, were not visible, likely having descended to lower altitude when their radio communication had failed. He was alone at 28,000 feet in the upper atmosphere, in an aircraft that had been damaged multiple times, with his fuel gauge indicating approximately 30 minutes of flight time remaining. The engagement that had begun with 5 Japanese fighters had ended with all of them either damaged or disengaging. Owens had survived. The question now was whether his aircraft would allow him to return to base. He checked his instruments methodically. Fuel state confirmed at critical thresholds, hydraulic pressure marginally but holding, engine temperatures elevated but within tolerance, electrical systems functioning. The damage was real, accumulated across the multiple engagements, but not immediately catastrophic. He had perhaps enough fuel to reach for if he descended immediately to a more efficient altitude and maintained a steady cruise setting. He had no certainty of this, no guarantee that some unseen damage would not force a catastrophic failure before he reached friendly territory. But the calculation was simple and unavoidable. He began a gentle descent from the thin air toward the lower atmosphere, where the Thunderbolt would fly more efficiently and where he might have a chance of reaching base live. The descent from 28,000 feet consumed time and fuel in nearly equal measure. Owens maintained a steady cruise setting, conserving every possible increment of efficiency, watching the fuel gauge with the focused intensity of a man whose survival had been reduced to a mathematical problem with only one acceptable solution. The damaged Thunderbolt flew with a subtle vibration that had not been present before the engagement. A rhythmic pulse that suggested something deep within the airframe had been compromised, but not catastrophically. He accepted it as part of the cost of the morning's events and did not allow it to distract him from the singular focus of reaching NOM-4 alive. At 15,000 feet, the air had thickened enough that the aircraft's performance began to improve. The engine, starved in the thin atmosphere, began to produce more consistent power. The controls, sluggish at altitude, became more responsive. The world below gradually transformed from abstract geometry into recognizable features: coastline, water, the distinctive shapes of islands that he had learned to identify through dozens of previous missions. Ground control had been attempting to re-establish contact with Owens since the radio interference had first fragmented communications. When his voice finally crackled through the static, confirming his identity and requesting vectors to NOM-4, the response came immediately. The radio operators, aware that an American fighter had engaged a Japanese formation at high altitude, were waiting for confirmation that the pilot had survived the encounter. Owens provided his position, his fuel state, and a terse account of the engagement. 5 Japanese fighters engaged. 4 damaged or disengaging. Aircraft damaged but flyable. Proceeding to base. The radio operator asked for clarification on the damage assessment, asked whether Owens required emergency services standing by. Owens declined, confident enough in his assessment of the Thunderbolt's remaining capability to believe that a normal landing was achievable. He was given vectors toward Noem and cleared to proceed. The final approach to the airfield consumed the last of Owens's fuel reserves with a precision that suggested the engagement had been calculated by someone intimately familiar with the mathematics of aviation. His fuel gauge read near empty as he crossed the threshold of the runway, the pierced steel matting stretching before him in the afternoon heat. He touched down smoothly, the Thunderbolt's landing gear absorbing the impact of arrival, and taxied toward the parking area, where the ground crews were already assembling. The aircraft rolled to a stop, and Owens sat motionless for a moment, aware of the sudden silence as the engine shut down, aware of the weight of fatigue that seemed to press against his entire body now that the immediate demand for survival had been satisfied. He unbuckled his harness, removed his oxygen mask, and climbed out of the cockpit into the tropical heat and humidity of Noem. The ground crew chief, Sergeant Paulson, was the first to reach him, his face creased with concern as he took in the extent of the damage visible on the aircraft's fuselage. Fresh bullet holes stitched across the tail section, the vertical stabilizer bearing a rent that came dangerously close to structural failure. The wing root showing evidence of sustained machine gun fire. Paulson's eyes moved from the damage to Owens and back again, and he released a long breath that seemed to contain both relief and something approximating awe. The other crew members gathered around, their eyes tracing the path of destruction across their aircraft, each new damage point a testament to the intensity of what had occurred at altitude. Owens provided a brief account: 5 Japanese fighters, multiple engagements, significant damage but flyable, and then made his way toward the squadron operations building complete the formal debriefing process. The intelligence officer conducting the debriefing was a captain named Rendell, a man who had conducted hundreds of pilot interviews, who possessed the particular skill of extracting coherent information from accounts that were often fragmented, emotional, or deliberately understated. Owens sat across from Rendell in a small room adjacent to the operations center, a cup of coffee cooling on the desk beside him, and provided his account of the engagement with the measured precision of someone accustomed to the process. The captain took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about altitudes, aircraft types, maneuver patterns, and the sequence of events. Owens found himself describing the physics of the engagement, the way the Thunderbolt's weight had provided advantage in climbing turns, the energy calculations that had determined who could sustain maneuvers at extreme altitude, the mathematics of fuel and ammunition consumption that had ultimately determined the engagement's outcome. As Owens spoke, word of the engagement began to spread through the squadron. Other pilots who had been on the mission, including Torres and Hartwell, arrived at the operations building and provided their own accounts of events. Torres and Hartwell, separated from Owens by the radio interference and the cloud layer, had descended to lower altitude and had not witnessed the engagement directly. But they had heard scattered transmissions, had pieced together fragments of what had occurred at altitude, and had participated in the search and rescue efforts that had been initiated when they returned to base without Owens. Their relief at his safe return was genuine and visible, a recognition that one of their own had survived something that easily could have been fatal. By late afternoon, the intelligence reports had been compiled and transmitted up the chain of command. 5 Japanese fighters engaged by a single P-47 pilot. 4 confirmed damaged or disengaging. Aircraft damaged but recovered. The engagement was remarkable by the standards of Pacific Air operations. The rarity of a single pilot achieving such tactical success against multiple opponents was not lost on anyone who reviewed the reports. But the response when it came was measured rather than celebratory. Owens was called to the squadron commander's office, commended for his tactical skill and courage, and informed that his actions would be noted in official records. The significance of the engagement was recognized, but it was recognized in the manner typical of military institutions, with formality rather than emotion. with the understanding that heroism in combat was both extraordinary and simultaneously routine. The nickname Meat Chopper, once applied casually to the aircraft's strafing capability, took on new weight as the engagement became known throughout the squadron. Other pilots began to regard the aircraft with renewed respect, aware that the combination of pilot skill and aircraft capability that it represented had proven devastatingly effective at extreme altitude. But for Owens himself, the evening following the engagement was marked by a kind of hollow quietness. He sat in the officers' club, nursing a drink, aware that the adrenaline that had sustained him through the morning had dissipated completely, leaving behind only fatigue and a kind of emotional numbness. Tomorrow would bring another mission. The war would continue. The morning's engagement, remarkable as it was in isolation, represented only one engagement among thousands that had been fought and would continue to be fought across the vast expanse of the Pacific theater. Maintenance crews worked through the night cataloging the damage to Meat Chopper, assessing which components could be repaired in place and which would require replacement. The structural damage to the vertical stabilizer was significant but repairable. The hydraulic lines would need to be replaced. The fuselage would require patching. By morning, they estimated, the aircraft would be ready to fly again. The ground crews understood that the aircraft's survival was itself a form of significance. It could fly again, could return to combat operations, could continue its role in the grinding attrition of the Pacific campaign. Owens, aware of the repair timeline, was aware as well that his own role in that continuing campaign would resume with whatever mission was scheduled for tomorrow. The war did not pause for reflection or recovery. It simply continued, day after day, engagement after engagement, until ultimately it ended or killed you. For now, Owens existed in the space between those outcomes, alive, wounded but functional, and conscious that the morning's remarkable engagement was simply one morning among many that stretched ahead into an uncertain future.